May 23, 1991. Early summer rains on the Black Sea coast. Sukhumi welcomes the new day in the usual rhythm. A noisy market, the smell of fruits and the sea, mountains wrapped in a light haze. In the distance was Pulkovo Airport, quiet and provincial, but it was from here that the road to the north, to the vast Leningrad, began. For some, this flight was a long-awaited return home. For others, it was a work trip, and for some, it was just a new stage in their lives. On the platform, as it had happened hundreds of times, stood a blue and white giant Tu-154B, the pride of Soviet aviation. The three-engine airliner, one of the most massive aircraft in the USSR, was able to connect cities thousands of kilometers away. Its recognizable silhouette, with its T-tail raised high and the gleam of its metal fuselage, inspired confidence. 181 people boarded, 174 passengers and 7 crew members. The crew was experienced. The aircraft's commander, Mikhail Mikhailov, is a highly accomplished pilot who is strict and demanding of himself and his colleagues. The co-pilot is Yuri Porozhkov, a young but already proven pilot, who was supposed to pilot the airliner during the final stage of the flight. Navigator Ivanov, flight engineer Suslin, and 3 flight attendants in the cabin complemented the well-coordinated team. For the passengers, they were a guarantee of safety and tranquility, but for themselves, they were just another flight, one of hundreds, but with the same level of responsibility. The weather in Sukhumi was clear, and the takeoff took place normally. The airliner left the ground confidently. Powerful D-30Ku turbojet engines roared, accelerating the 100-ton car across the concrete. Seconds later, the nose lifted, and the plane, like a huge arrow, cut through the morning sky. At this moment, nothing foreshadowed trouble. But this is always the case in aviation. When passengers sit comfortably in their seats, take out books, or close their eyes in a half-doze, somewhere ahead there is already a chain of events that will decide the outcome of the entire flight. Sometimes it's a chain of luck, a fair wind, clear skies, and a soft landing gear touch at the destination airport. And sometimes it's a chain of mistakes, weather, and circumstances that connect to a point of no return. Everything looked perfect in Sukhumi. The sun, the mountains, and the plane climbing. But in Leningrad, where Flight 8556 was supposed to end, rains and thunderclouds were gathering over the city. There, in Pulkovo, the technical system that helps pilots land on instruments was temporarily disabled for maintenance. And although all this was recorded in the warnings, the crew did not pay attention to the recording. A small detail, barely noticeable in the daily routine, will be the first in a long chain. The contrast was striking. In the south, passengers admired the bright sea, and in the north, the elements were already raging. Where it was warm and calm in the morning, clouds and heavy rain awaited them in the evening. And it's as if the sky itself decided to test how durable human skills and iron machines are when faced with the unpredictability of the weather. At that moment, no one on board had any idea that the flight, which began so casually, would in a few hours end up in the chronicles of Soviet aviation as one of the most discussed and tragic. The passengers settled into the cabin, and the liner set course. For many, this was a familiar route. The flight from Sukhumi to Leningrad was operated regularly, connecting the south and north of the vast country. There was a casual atmosphere in the cabin. Someone was reading a newspaper, children were enthusiastically looking at the portholes, and flight attendants were carrying out last-minute checks and handing out drinks. Everything looked the same as it had hundreds of times before. But something completely different was happening in the cabin. Work was already beginning there, requiring maximum concentration. The crew shared responsibilities. Commander Mikhailov kept overall coordination, co-pilot Porozhkov led the controls, navigator Ivanov checked course and altitude, and engineer Suslin monitored all aircraft systems. The Tu-154B was a complex machine, almost a living organism. He did not have automation at the level of modern airliners. Each stage of the flight required manual control. Altitude control, speed control, flap release, and landing gear control were all accompanied by constant dialogue within the crew. For experienced pilots, such a workload was familiar, but it was precisely in it that the vulnerability was hidden. One wrong decision or a delay in the command could change the trajectory of an entire flight. The plane flew on the northern route through the Chernozem region, then to Leningrad. The weather remained favorable on the way, and visibility was excellent. At such moments, there is an illusion of complete control. People on board feel confident, as if everything is predetermined. Here we take off, here we fly, here we land. But aviation knows another law. The calmer the middle of the route, the more dangerous its end can be. The peculiarity of this particular flight was that initially the aircraft was limited in its capabilities. One of the thrust reversals, the system that helps to brake after landing, did not work. For passengers, it was an inconspicuous detail because technically the car could operate the flight without him. But for the pilots, this meant additional stress. In the event of a long or hard landing, there would be less chance of quickly reducing speed. The situation looked ambivalent. On the one hand, the experienced crew and the serviceable aircraft all indicated that the flight would be carried out normally. On the other hand, there was a risk already at the start. The weather in Leningrad worsened, and the precision approach system was disabled. These two factors added up to a dangerous equation that the pilots had not yet begun to solve. No one in the salon knew about it. There was a familiar atmosphere. Children were laughing, someone was dozing, someone was discussing business. Outwardly, everything was perfect, but there was already an invisible tension in the cabin. The co-pilot understood that he would be responsible for the approach, and the commander, known for his demanding nature, was not going to sit on the sidelines. In this hidden dynamic, a strict mentor and subordinate who must prove his worth, lies the very psychological pressure that will later become fatal. Sukhumi has already been left behind. Leningrad was approaching. The weather there was not going to forgive mistakes, and the crew had to face the most difficult thing, entering in conditions of heavy rain with minimal landmarks, and even with the feeling that it was impossible to retreat. The Tu-154 was heading north, moving further away from the warm southern coast. The flight took place at an altitude of several thousand meters, and landscapes changed under the wings, from emerald plains to cloud carpets, where the sun was reflected in the snow-white peaks of cumulus clouds. For passengers, it was a calm flight, a typical picture of aviation in the early 90s, when even a long flight seemed like an ordinary road. Everything looked different in the cockpit. Every hour was accompanied by route reconciliation, instrument monitoring, and work with dispatchers. Communication with ground services was kept on radio channels, and each time the pilots received new weather and route information. The USSR aviation lived by strict rules. From the altitude of the echelon to the engine mode, everything was recorded in the flight logs. But it was precisely such routine moments that became treacherous. A day before the flight to Pulkovo, the glide path system was turned off, the same radio beacon that helps crews to get exactly on the glide path when entering. There was a note about this in the documents, and warnings were sent to the dispatchers. But the crew of Flight 8556 had not looked into them by the time of departure. As a result, they only knew what the current weather and the ATIS system told them, broadcasting the actual data to all arrivals. At the time of listening, everything looked tolerable. Clouds were high, visibility was up to 10 kilometers. In their eyes, nothing critical was going to happen. The difference between the 2 points of the route was huge. Where the liner was sailing through the clear sky over Voronezh and Tver, a foggy wall of precipitation was already beginning to thicken in the Leningrad region. But pilots used to trust the schedule and their experience. Flights were rarely canceled due to the weather, and even more so, no one expected a disaster. The passengers in the cabin continued to go about their business. For some, this was their first trip on such a large liner, while others already knew how smoothly its automation worked at the train level and how gently it responded to turbulence. No one thought that the most important part of the flight, boarding, was still ahead, and that it would be a test. In the cockpit, conversations became more restrained. Commander Mikhailov, despite his experience, was a man of a tough style. He did not tolerate mistakes, and his interventions during visits were well known to colleagues. Co-pilot Porozhkov, on the other hand, saw this flight as a chance to show that he could cope on his own. But it wasn't the ideal conditions of the gym that awaited him, but the real elements. It was as if nature had divided the sky into two worlds. The calm southern part of the country remained behind, and the rainy north ahead, where every mistake in management could be fatal. This is the peculiarity of aviation. While the airliner is flying calmly at altitude, it seems that everything is under control. But the closer to the ground, the higher the price of every little thing. And it was on the approach to Leningrad, when the clouds closed over the city and the rain fell in a wall, that the crew realized that the upcoming descent would be far from educational. The airliner entered the area of the Leningrad aviation hub at the beginning of the day. At first, everything looked calm. The train was steady. Communication with the dispatchers was uninterrupted. But it was here that what is called the hidden trap in aviation began, when every little thing adds up to a chain. By this time, the weather in Pulkovo had deteriorated sharply. The rain clouds, like a leaden ceiling, dropped only a few hundred meters. The wind brought new portions of rain, and visibility dropped rapidly. From the ground, the dispatchers saw how the band was barely visible through the water, but the crew was not informed of all the relevant data. They were guided by the old ATIS information, which spoke about a 1,000-meter cloud cover and a dozen kilometers of visibility. At an altitude of 1,800 meters, the crew was instructed to descend to 900. Everything looked routine. The dispatcher gave permission, the pilots complied. But they did not request radar control, that is, they did not specify the actual position of the aircraft in space. This detail seems like a formality, but it is precisely such missed steps that become crucial. Then there is a new resolution, a decrease to 600 meters, that is, per circle. By this time, the clouds had already dropped to 270 meters, and the field of view had virtually disappeared. But no one in the cabin knew about it. The precision approach system was disabled, and the crew did not have the very safety rope that takes the aircraft onto the glide path even in zero visibility. At an altitude of 600 meters, they began to perform the fourth U-turn. The runway was only about 8 kilometers away. The rain was hitting the windows, the wipers were working continuously, but the view was still limited. And here the psychological factor worked. The crew, being almost at the finish line, believed that since the landmarks were visually visible, landing was feasible. However, it was the combination of these factors that made the situation dangerous. Weather conditions were constantly changing, and the crew continued to operate according to old data. And although formally everything went according to procedure, heights, turns, reports to the dispatcher, the real picture was already completely different. This was the paradox. When controllers on the ground could observe the deterioration of the weather and changing conditions, in the sky the pilots remained under the illusion that everything was under control. And instead of preparing to leave for the second round, they continued to decline, believing that once we started, we'll make it. The dry sky is behind and the black wall is ahead. The contrast between the calm route and the stormy finale was getting stronger. And although the passengers in the cabin only heard the sound of rain outside the windows, a struggle was already beginning in the cabin, between procedure and reality, between human stubbornness and common sense. When the Tu-154 entered the landing lane, there were only a few kilometers left. All the crew's attention was focused on the instruments and, through the downpour, on the rare landmarks that could still be seen. At this stage, the interaction inside the cockpit should have been decisive. One pilot drives the car, the second controls the parameters, the navigator confirms the heights and distances, the commander makes strategic decisions. But it was here that coherence failed. Co-pilot Porozhkov was flying the plane. His task is to keep the glide path and speed within acceptable limits. But heavy rain, turbulence, and the lack of an accurate radio beacon made the task more difficult. The vertical speed gradually increased, and the liner began to move below the calculated trajectory. Normally, it was the commander who should have given the order to leave for the second round in time if the parameters went beyond the limits. But Mikhailov instead interfered with the management, correcting his colleague and thereby only increasing the tension. The psychological burden was growing. The co-pilot saw that the altitude was dropping faster than necessary. He understood that the situation was close to the limit. But the commander was sitting next to him, a man with experience and authority, whose amendments were perceived as orders. It turned out to be a vicious circle. One tried to prove his independence, the other tried to keep control. And as a result, not a single decisive decision was made. The navigator announced the altitude, 150 meters, speed 260. But the key signal, going to the second round, did not follow. The vertical speed exceeded the norm, and the plane was already below the decision height. This is the very mark where either the pilot sees the lane clearly and sits down, or goes up to repeat the approach. The carriage passed it in silence. Meanwhile, another violation was taking place at the control room. It was at this critical moment that the dispatcher changed. The new employee did not have time to get up to speed, did not conduct radio exchange, and did not control the lowering of the board. No one from Earth noticed that the airliner had already gone below the permissible trajectory. Mistakes multiplied like links in a chain. The understatement inside the cockpit, the commander's interference, the co-pilot's silence, and the lack of control from the dispatcher all combined into one downward vector. And the closer the lane was, the less time was left to fix it. Outside, the rain was only getting heavier. The strip was hidden behind a curtain of water. But there was a short and cold command in the cockpit. Get in. There were just over 3 kilometers left to the end of the strip. The rain was pounding on the cabin windows, the wipers were working at maximum, but visibility was still limited. The liner was traveling at an excess of the vertical descent speed, and at the same time was below the calculated glide path. At such times, the standard instructions strictly prescribe going to the second round, but in the cabin they dragged on to the last. The navigator said the numbers again, 150 meters. He saw that the car was going down too fast, and he knew that a decision was needed right now. But the command did not sound. The co-pilot, busy holding the course and dampening the turbulent fluctuations, was waiting for the commander's order. But the commander, on the contrary, believed that the situation was under control and did not want to give up. At an altitude of about 60 meters above the ground, when the strip was just over 2 kilometers away, the tension reached its limit. The navigator cautiously asked the commander about the assessment, hoping to hear the order to go into the set. But the answer was short. Let's sit down. At that time, the dispatcher, who had just taken over the shift, was not actively monitoring. The radio was silent, as if no one on the ground had noticed that the plane had already dropped critically below the glide path. The liner actually found itself in a zone where every second decides everything. At an altitude of about 20 meters, it became clear that the landing would be tough. The plane descended too abruptly. The vertical speed reached 7 meters per second, almost twice as high as the permissible speed. The crew suddenly realized the danger and tried to rectify the situation. The engines were brought to maximum thrust, the steering wheel was taken over, but the inertia of the multi-ton machine no longer allowed to change the trajectory. In those last seconds, the liner seemed to freeze between two outcomes. It was still possible to go into the set, but reality was pressing down. The people in the cabin may have felt only an uncharacteristic jolt and increased engine noise. For the crew, every second turned into an eternity, a struggle for control that was solved literally meters to the ground. It was here that it became clear. The chain of errors had reached its final point. At 1:06 p.m., at a speed of about 250 kilometers per hour, the heavy 3-engine liner touched down. But instead of a soft touch by the main landing gear struts, something happened that aviation tries to avoid at all costs. The nose strut hit the ground first. This was due to the fact that the plane was at an angle to the glide path, only 1 degree, but it was enough for the moment of touch to be catastrophic. The overload reached 4.5 G, almost twice as high as allowed for such a machine. The impact was so strong that the fuselage could not stand it. The nose went down, then the main struts pierced the concrete edge of the end runway, and inertia carried the liner off the runway. A moment later, the plane, which had seemed like a monolith a second ago, began to collapse. The metal body, designed for enormous loads in the air, proved powerless before hitting concrete at high speed. The fuselage was torn into 3 pieces. The tail was torn off and turned to the right. It froze at the edge of the lane. The middle section with wings went forward by inertia, losing the skin and structural elements. The nose section, partially detached, stopped only after tens of meters, turning into a twisted fragment. Inside, everything happened in a split second. For the passengers and crew, There was a sudden jolt, incredible pressure, and chaos. The cabin, which a minute ago was filled with the usual noise of engines and the slight hum of air conditioners, turned into a space of sharp blows, screams, and screeching metal. People were literally thrown out of their usual time, from an ordinary flight into the chaos of a catastrophe. From the outside, the picture looked eerily contrasting. The downpour did not stop. The rain beat on the debris, as if nature itself emphasized. The elements here are stronger than man. Black smoke, steam from incandescent parts, the sheen of wet concrete and debris scattered across the runway. This is how the flight ended, which began just a few hours ago amid the sun and the sea of Sukhumi. The crew tried to save the situation to the last, bringing thrust to maximum, trying to equalize the angle of attack, but the laws of physics no longer allowed to change the outcome. A multi-ton car flying above vertical speed simply had no way to stop smoothly. It was a moment of truth, when a combination of decisions, delays, and circumstances materialized in a single blow that divided the history of Flight 8556 into before and after. When the first shocking footage of the wrecked liner hit the airwaves, it became clear that something had happened that the USSR tried to keep out of the news reports. Until that time, aviation accidents were hushed up, and the phrase "planes don't crash here" was almost an official rule. But now it was impossible to hide the disaster. Rescuers and journalists were working at the scene, and everyone was talking about the tragedy. The investigation was entrusted to the USSR State Aviation Supervision Commission. Engineers, pilots, and specialists reconstructed the last minutes of the flight in great detail. We studied the flight recorders, analyzed the crew's negotiations, checked weather data and dispatcher readings. The picture was not easy. The aircraft was technically sound, despite the disabled reverse of one engine, an unpleasant factor but not critical. The main problem was the human factor. The co-pilot, who was supposed to be flying the plane on landing, found himself under pressure from the situation. He performed the approach in difficult conditions: heavy rain, cloudy skies, lack of an accurate approach system. But the key was the commander's intervention. Mikhailov did not let the subordinate drive the car on his own, constantly corrected and thereby knocked down concentration. As a result, the critical moment, the decision to retire to the second round, was missed. The navigator named the heights in a timely manner, but did not take the initiative to give the command "leave." His job was to inform but not to decide. The co-pilot saw that the vertical speed was exceeded, and that the liner was sagging below the glide path. But, violating the instructions, he did not make an independent attempt to leave. And the commander, instead of stopping the approach, insisted on landing. An additional link was the situation on the ground. It was at the moment when the airliner was at a critical altitude that an employee changed in the control room. The new dispatcher did not enter into radio exchange and did not control the descent. No one from Earth told the crew that they were going below the trajectory. All this combined to form the very death spiral of mistakes. Each individual slip would not have been fatal, but added together, they left no chance. The commission concluded that the cause of the tragedy was the psychological attitude of landing the plane at all costs. The pilots were afraid to admit the approach was unsuccessful. To go to the second round meant admitting a mistake, getting reprimanded and losing points in the eyes of colleagues. This setup turned out to be stronger than common sense and instructions. For a long time, there was an unspoken rule in the Soviet Union. Aviation is a symbol of reliability and progress, and any accidents should not cast a shadow on this image. If something happened, only specialists knew about it, the materials went to the archives, but the information did not reach the general public. But in the early 90s, the country was rapidly changing, and it turned out to be impossible to hide the crash of Flight 8556. Newspapers wrote about the tragedy and showed stories on television. For the Soviet viewer, this came as a shock. For the first time, a large-scale plane crash with a passenger plane was openly reported in the news. People who are used to the slogan "planes don't fall" are faced with a harsh reality. The society was divided. Some demanded to punish the perpetrators. Others wondered, how come we had the best aviation? Facts that had previously been discussed only in the professional environment began to surface. Malfunctions, crew fatigue, and dispatcher errors. The system, which had been building an image of perfection for decades, suddenly cracked. It was this disaster that became a kind of frontier. She tore off the veil of silence and showed that even in such a well-established field as civil aviation, tragedies are possible. Moreover, they occur not because of malicious intent or technical failures, but because of a chain of human errors. For passengers, this was an alarming signal. The flight no longer seemed to be an absolute guarantee of safety. For pilots, it is a painful lesson in how psychological pressure can be no less dangerous than a storm or engine failure. For society, it is a reminder of the fragility of a system in which there are no small things. So for the first time, in front of millions of viewers and readers, the myth that we have everything under control literally collapsed. After the investigation was completed, the most painful stage came: the allocation of responsibility. In the Soviet system, mistakes by the crew or dispatchers were rarely dealt with publicly. But this time, under the scrutiny of society and the media, names had to be named and measures taken. Co-pilot Purashkov was the first to be hit. It was he who led the plane on landing, and it was he who had to make the decision to go on a second lap when the parameters went beyond the limits. The commission recognized that he had failed in his duties, made critical deviations, and violated the rules of interaction with the commander. As a result of the proceedings, Purashkov received a severe reprimand and was excluded from the list of candidates for promotion to the commander of the aircraft. For the pilot, this meant the end of his career. Commander Mikhailov, who was formally responsible for everything that was happening in the cockpit, was on leave for health reasons at the time of the crash. His participation in the flight was explained by the desire to maintain flight operations and personal control over the crew. After the disaster, measures were applied to him later, when he returned to service. The duties of the commander were limited, and his future career was in doubt. The dispatching service was also not left without punishment. Senior dispatcher Orlov, who allowed the employee to be replaced at the most critical moment, was relieved of his post for 3 months. For the rest, severe reprimands and warnings. It would seem that the measures are not too harsh, but in the context of Soviet aviation, it was a serious blow to reputation. The wording sounded harsh. Violations of discipline were committed, non-compliance with procedures. But behind those words, there was a tragedy for specific people. Everyone understood. The chain of events was formed not only from their mistakes, but also from the general system, where the fear of appearing weak and unwillingness to go to the second round turned out to be stronger than common sense. For the passengers and their families, the disciplinary penalties seemed too lenient. But for the aviation community, they have become a cold reminder. Mistakes in the sky come at too high a price, and formal punishments are just the tip of the iceberg. If you think back to the morning of May 23rd in Sukhumi, everything looks just as calm. The sun is reflected in the terminal windows. Children are waving goodbye to the mourners. Flight attendants are smiling at passengers heading down the ramp. No one could have imagined then that in just a few hours this flight would go down in history not as an ordinary flight, but as a tragic milestone. Aviation has always balanced between two extremes: human confidence and the ruthless laws of physics. The same people who feel like masters of the sky at a height of kilometers are helpless in front of one wrong decision below. In the case of Flight 8556, this balance was disrupted. A chain of small omissions, an unreadable warning, an untimely report, a change of dispatcher, a delay with the team, turned into a disaster. The main conclusion that the experts made sounded paradoxically simple. There are no small things in aviation. Every line in the bulletin, every report on altitude, every word on the air can become the very frontier where the fate of hundreds of people is being decided. This disaster was a lesson for the country and at the same time a blow to the myth of the infallibility of the system. For the first time, the Soviet media openly reported that planes could be in distress, and they did so in front of millions. It was a shock for the passengers, an alarming signal for the pilots. In the cockpit, it is not enough just to follow the instructions. You need to have the courage to admit that the approach was unsuccessful and go on a second lap. And, perhaps most importantly, this story showed the price of invisible mistakes. They are not seen by passengers. They are not heard on the news until the very end. But it is they who, having accumulated, turn into a moment of truth when a multi-ton liner collapses onto concrete instead of a soft landing. May 23, 1991, began as an ordinary day for 181 people. It ended differently for 166 of them, and for all aviation, it became a reminder. The air does not forgive self-confidence, and even an experienced crew in a clear sky can be trapped by their own decisions.